"Step aside, ma'am. This lounge is reserved for real executives," the man said, loud enough to turn heads. And just like that, the quiet hum of the Sky Lounge fractured at 30,000 feet above expectation, where polished marble floors and soft jazz weren't supposed to carry words like that. But they did, sharp and deliberate. And Naomi Carter stood still in front of the glass check-in podium, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, fitted jeans, and white sneakers that didn't match the room's idea of wealth. Not here, not in a place where status was supposed to be visible, branded, undeniable. And yet she didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even glance at the growing line behind her as the boarding screen flashed final call. 11 minutes, because she had seen this before, not once, not twice, but enough times to recognize the tone before the words even landed. That subtle shift from service to suspicion, from welcome to warning. And the manager, tall, clean-cut, with a badge that read Ethan Brooks, stepped closer like proximity alone could assert authority. "If you don't have proper access credentials, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the lounge," he added, slower this time, like he was explaining something obvious, something she should already know. And a few seated passengers looked up from their phones, their eyes flicking between Naomi and the man like they were watching something unfold they couldn't quite name yet, while a junior attendant off to the side hesitated, her fingers hovering over a tablet, her expression tightening just enough to suggest doubt, but not enough to interrupt. Not yet. And Naomi finally moved, not backward, not away, but forward just half a step, placing her boarding pass on the counter with a calm that didn't match the tension rising in the room. "Run my name," she said, her voice even, almost quiet, but it carried, it always carried. And Ethan didn't touch the pass, didn't even look down at it, just gave a small, dismissive smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, this isn't about names, it's about clearance," he replied, and somewhere behind them, a phone lifted slightly, not fully recording, just enough to capture a moment. That already felt off, already felt like it was tipping toward something bigger, and Naomi's gaze didn't break, didn't waver. But there was something behind it now, something old, something practiced, the memory of being told at 22 in a crowded terminal that her ticket must have been a mistake, that first class wasn't for people like her. The memory of stepping aside then, of swallowing it, of waiting, and then building something so large, so quiet, so powerful that rooms like this would one day carry her name whether they knew it or not. And now here she was again, same tone, different faces, same mistake, and the boarding clock ticked down to 10 minutes as Ethan straightened his posture and gestured subtly toward the exit, signaling security with nothing more than a look. And Naomi reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone with a motion so controlled it almost felt rehearsed, her thumb hovering for half a second before she spoke. Not to him, not to the room, but into the line that connected far beyond it. "Log this," she said, calm as ever, "and start executive audit." And for a brief moment, the lounge didn't feel like a lounge anymore. It felt like a system about to realize it had just misjudged the one person it should have recognized immediately. The word audit did not echo loudly, but it landed like a pressure drop, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. And for a second Ethan Brooks hesitated, not because he understood what she meant, but because something in her tone did not match the situation he thought he controlled. Yet he recovered quickly, straightening his jacket, forcing a small laugh that felt practiced. "Ma'am, you are not authorized to initiate anything here," he said, louder now, as if volume could restore order, while the junior attendant's tablet flickered in her hands, her eyes scanning something new that had just appeared, something she did not expect to see. And the boarding screen above shifted again, 9 minutes remaining. The ticking clock now louder than the music, louder than the quiet conversations that had stopped entirely, because people were no longer pretending not to watch. They were watching, openly, curiously, cautiously, as Naomi Carter stood unmoved, her phone still at her side, her expression calm but no longer neutral. There was intent there now, measured and precise, and Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice this time, trying a different tactic. "If you continue to disrupt operations, I will have to escalate this," he said, the word escalate hanging awkwardly between them, because it was already too late for that. The system had already begun to move, unseen but very real, and behind the counter the junior attendant swallowed, then finally spoke, hesitant but clear. "Sir." Her name just triggered a corporate flag, she said, not looking up from the screen, and Ethan frowned, irritation flashing across his face. "Then clear it. That is what you are trained to do," he snapped quietly. But the attendant did not move, did not tap, did not override, because what she was seeing could not be cleared. It could only be acknowledged, and Naomi watched the shift happen in real time. The exact moment authority began to slip, the same way she had seen it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in rooms much quieter and much more dangerous than this one. And she remembered another airport years ago, standing in line with a valid ticket, while someone insisted there had been a mistake, that she should step aside, that someone else needed the seat more, and she had stepped aside then. She had waited, she had learned, and she had built something that would never require her to step aside. Again, not here, not anywhere. And now the air inside the lounge felt different, heavier, charged with something none of them could name yet. As a man seated near the window leaned forward, whispering to the woman beside him, "This is not going the way he thinks," and the woman nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Naomi, while Ethan reached for his radio, his fingers tightening around it just enough to show strain. "Security. I need assistance at the front," he said, his voice controlled but no longer confident, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, almost curious, almost patient, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. Because escalation was not something she feared, it was something she used, and her phone vibrated softly in her hand. A single confirmation, silent but definitive, and she glanced down just briefly before looking back up at Ethan, her voice steady, unchanged. "You already escalated this," she said, and this time there was no softness in it, only certainty. "You just did not realize who you escalated it to." And somewhere behind the counter the system refreshed again, and the junior attendant's breath caught as new lines of authority began to appear, not removing Naomi, but rewriting everything around her. The radio call hung in the air for a fraction too long, long enough for doubt to settle where confidence had just been, and Ethan Brooks felt it, not fully, not consciously, but enough to shift his stance as the junior attendant slowly turned the tablet toward him, her hands no longer steady. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, her voice lower now, careful, like she was stepping into something she did not fully understand. And Ethan glanced down, expecting a routine override, a simple clearance issue, something he could dismiss with a tap, but what stared back at him was not a warning, not a flag. It was a full system overlay. Executive-level authorization cascading across the screen in clean, undeniable lines. And for the first time since this began, his expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for those watching to notice, while Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, centered, composed, as if the entire moment had been timed down to the second, and the boarding clock shifted again, 8 minutes remaining, the numbers sharper now, louder somehow, as if counting down not just to departure, but to something else entirely. And a man near the espresso bar stood up slowly, no longer pretending to scroll on his phone. "What is happening?" he asked, not to anyone in particular, but the question landed anyway, because everyone in the room was asking it now, silently or not. And Ethan straightened, forcing control back into his voice. "This is a system error," he said quickly, too quickly, reaching for the tablet as if proximity could rewrite what it displayed. But the attendant did not let go immediately, her grip tightening. "For just a second, it is not an error," she said, barely above a whisper. "It is an executive audit, and it is live." And the word live shifted everything, because live meant active, live meant visible, live meant accountable. And Naomi's gaze moved from the screen back to Ethan, steady and unwavering. And there was no anger there, no raised emotion, just a clarity that made the moment heavier. "You should read it carefully," she said, her tone even, almost instructive, and Ethan did, despite himself, his eyes scanning the top line, then the next, then stopping completely as recognition finally caught up with reality, and the air in the lounge tightened like a held breath, because whatever he was seeing, it was not small, it was not local, it was not something that could be handled quietly. And behind him the automatic doors slid open as 2 security personnel stepped inside, their presence calm but firm, trained to respond, not to question, yet even they slowed slightly, reading the room before taking another step, because something was off, something was not aligning with the usual pattern of removal and compliance. And Naomi turned her head just enough to acknowledge them, not with fear, not with resistance, but with the same calm authority she had carried from the beginning. And for a brief second, one of them hesitated, as if unsure who exactly they were there to assist, while Ethan lowered the tablet slowly, his voice no longer sharp, no longer certain. "Who are you?" he asked, the question finally spoken out loud. And Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to feel it, for the weight of it to settle into every corner, every glance, every held breath, before she stepped forward again, closing the distance not aggressively but deliberately, and said, "The better question is, why did you decide I did not belong before you even asked?" And this time, no one in the lounge looked away. The question did not land as an answer but as a mirror, and Ethan Brooks felt it immediately, the weight of it pressing against everything he had said just minutes ago. And for the first time he did not have a response ready, his mouth parting slightly before closing again as the silence around them thickened, not empty but charged. And behind him the junior attendant stepped back, no longer trying to manage the situation, because it was no longer manageable, it was unfolding, and the system on her screen continued to populate line after line, each one more precise than the last: executive access logs, internal review flags, timestamps that matched every word spoken in the last few minutes. And she swallowed hard, whispering almost to herself, "It is recording everything." While the two security officers exchanged a quick glance, subtle but telling, their posture shifting from intervention to observation, because instinct told them this was no longer a removal. This was something else entirely, and Naomi Carter remained still at the center of it, not dominating the space, not raising her presence, but somehow becoming the point everything else now rotated around. And she watched Ethan carefully, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with a calm expectation, as if giving him one final chance to understand what had already happened. And the boarding screen above flickered again, 7 minutes remaining, the countdown now undeniable, and a woman seated near the window stood up slowly, her voice cutting through the tension. "You did not even check her name," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. And that single sentence shifted the room again, because it was simple, undeniable, and true. And Ethan turned slightly toward her, then back to Naomi, his authority slipping not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, visible fractures, one after another. "This is standard protocol," he tried again, but the words sounded thinner now, less certain, and Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her expression unchanged. "Protocol requires verification," she said, her tone steady, precise. "You chose assumption," and that word assumption settled heavier than anything before. Because it named what everyone had just witnessed, stripped of justification, stripped of policy, leaving only the truth behind it. And for a moment no one spoke, not the staff, not the passengers, not even the music seemed to carry through the space anymore, as if the room itself was listening. And then Naomi's phone vibrated again, a second confirmation, longer this time, and she glanced at it briefly before lifting her eyes back to Ethan. And there was a shift there now, subtle but unmistakable, the moment before something irreversible, and she spoke again, quieter than before, but with a clarity that cut deeper than any raised voice could have. "This is the part where you decide how much of this becomes public," she said, and Ethan's gaze flickered, just for a second, toward the passengers, toward the phones now fully raised, no longer pretending, no longer hidden, because whatever this was, it was no longer contained. And the junior attendant took a slow breath, then finally stepped forward, her voice steadier now, stronger. "Sir." Her profile just unlocked full ownership access, she said. And the word ownership did not echo. It settled, heavy and final, and for a brief moment, the entire lounge seemed to pause, caught between what had been assumed and what was now undeniable. And Naomi did not move, did not smile, did not react outwardly at all, because she did not need to. The system had already begun to speak for her, and it was not finished yet. Ownership did not sound loud when it was spoken, but it changed everything in the room at once, like a silent switch flipping behind the walls, and Ethan Brooks felt it before he fully understood it, his posture tightening, his grip on authority slipping in ways he could not control, while the junior attendant slowly stepped back from the counter as if distance might protect her from what was unfolding. Her eyes still locked on the screen that now displayed Naomi Carter's profile in full, not partial, not restricted, but complete, and the lines were unmistakable: parent company access, executive override, controlling stake, and beneath it all a name that carried more weight than anyone in that lounge had realized until now. And the air shifted again, heavier, denser, as if the space itself was recalibrating around a truth that had been ignored just moments earlier, and a man near the center table exhaled. Softly, shaking his head, "This is not going to end well for them," he murmured, not quietly enough to go unheard, and Ethan's eyes flickered toward him before returning to Naomi, searching now, not commanding, trying to find something that would restore balance, something that would undo the last few minutes. But there was nothing left to hold on to, because the system did not lie, and it did not hesitate. And Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the start, unchanged, steady, her presence now undeniable, not because she raised it, but because everything else had lowered around her, and she took a slow breath, not for herself, but for the room, for the moment that had finally arrived. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, not louder, but final. "You asked who I am," she said, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "You should have asked that before you decided I did not belong." And the words landed with precision, cutting through every excuse that had been building in his mind, every attempt to reframe what had happened, because there was no reframing it now, only recognition. And behind him the security officers shifted again, their stance no longer aligned with him, no longer positioned to remove her, but uncertain, waiting, because authority had moved, and they could feel it even if they did not fully understand it yet. And the boarding clock dropped to 6 minutes. The urgency of departure now pressing against the tension in the room, but no one moved. Not a single passenger reached for their bags. Not a single staff member resumed their duties, because something more important than a flight was happening right in front of them. And Naomi's phone vibrated once more, longer this time, sustained, and she glanced down briefly before lifting it slightly, just enough for Ethan to see the confirmation screen, the official seal, the internal system acknowledgement that left no room for doubt. And she tilted her head just slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. "This lounge operates under Carter Global Holdings," she said, each word measured, deliberate, "and every executive assigned to it reports through a chain that ends with me." And there it was, not shouted, not dramatized, just stated, clean and undeniable. And the silence that followed was no longer tense, it was absolute, because the truth had finally arrived, and there was nothing left to hide behind. The words did not need repetition because their impact had already settled into every corner of the lounge, and Ethan Brooks stood there as if the ground beneath his authority had quietly disappeared, not collapsing in a dramatic fall, but dissolving piece by piece, leaving him with nothing solid to stand on. And for a moment he tried to speak, his lips parting as if a defense might still exist, but nothing came out, because there was nothing left to defend, and Naomi Carter watched him without urgency, without pressure, simply allowing the truth to complete its work. And behind the counter the system continued to update in real time, each new line reinforcing what had already been revealed: executive oversight logs, compliance triggers, internal review flags now marked active. And the junior attendant took another step back, her voice barely steady as she spoke again. "The audit is escalating. It is pulling executive access records." And that single sentence shifted the focus completely, because this was no longer about a denied entry, it was about accountability. And the security officers lowered their hands slightly, their stance no longer aligned with removal, but with observation, their training telling them to follow authority. And authority had clearly changed, and a man near the center table shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "They really did this to the wrong person," he said. And this time no one disagreed, because the evidence was no longer subtle. It was visible, undeniable, unfolding in real time. And the boarding clock dropped to 5 minutes, the numbers flashing with urgency, but still no one moved, not even the staff who were supposed to manage the flow of passengers, because the moment had outgrown the space, outgrown the schedule, outgrown everything they thought mattered just minutes ago. and Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not stepping away, not stepping forward, but grounding herself in the moment as her phone vibrated again, a longer sequence this time, layered confirmations stacking one over another, and she glanced down briefly before lifting her gaze back to Ethan, her expression unchanged, calm but absolute, and she spoke again, her voice carrying the final clarity of someone who did not need to prove anything further. "This is no longer about access," she said, each word deliberate. "This is about how your team operates when they think no one is watching." And that sentence landed deeper than anything before it, because it exposed not just the action, but the pattern behind it, the assumption, the unchecked behavior, the quiet decisions made in moments just like this one. And Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, not in surrender, but in realization. The slow recognition that this was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake that could be corrected with an apology. This was something recorded, documented, already moving beyond him. And behind him the junior attendant looked up from the screen, her voice steadier now, clearer. "Corporate has joined the audit," she said, and the word corporate carried a different weight now, heavier, final, and Naomi's gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was something in it now that felt like conclusion, not anger, not triumph, but resolution, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this moment began, and the room, once filled with quiet luxury, now felt like a place of reckoning, where silence no longer protected anything, and the system continued to run, uninterrupted, precise, and very far from finished. Corporate did not arrive with footsteps or voices, but with presence, invisible and immediate, and the moment the junior attendant said it, the system behind her screen shifted again, faster now, more decisive, as if the oversight that had just joined was no longer observing but acting, and Ethan Brooks felt it in the way the silence changed, no longer uncertain but directed, no longer waiting but closing in, and he glanced at the tablet again, this time not to challenge it, but to understand it. His eyes scanning lines that now carried timestamps, recorded statements, escalation markers, each one tied to him, to his decisions, to the exact words he had chosen just minutes ago, and his throat tightened slightly, not from fear alone but from realization, because this was no longer contained within the lounge. This was already beyond it, already moving through channels he could not access, could not control, and Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. But the room around her had transformed completely, no longer a place of quiet privilege but a space where truth had surfaced and refused to be ignored. And one of the security officers stepped back half a pace, subtle but clear, his stance shifting away from Ethan entirely, as if aligning himself with a different authority, and the second officer followed without needing instruction, because instinct told them everything they needed to know, and a woman near the entrance lowered her phone slightly, whispering to the man beside her, "This is bigger than a mistake," and he nodded without taking his eyes off Naomi, because at this point no one was questioning her presence anymore. They were questioning everything that had led to this moment, and the boarding clock dropped to 4 minutes, flashing in bold letters that now felt almost irrelevant compared to what was unfolding. And Naomi's phone vibrated again, a steady sequence that confirmed what the room was beginning to understand, and she lifted it just slightly, not to show off, not to prove, but simply to acknowledge what was already in motion. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the final authority of someone who had allowed every chance for correction to pass. "Executive oversight has full visibility now," she said, her tone calm but absolute. "Every decision made in this space is being reviewed in real time." And Ethan's gaze dropped for just a second, the weight of that sentence settling fully, because there was no distance left between action and consequence, no delay, no buffer. And behind the counter the junior attendant took a slow breath, her voice steadier than before. "Sir, they are pulling executive credentials," she said, and the word pulling did not sound dramatic, but its implication was immediate. Access, authority, position, all of it now subject to review. And Ethan straightened slightly, a final attempt to regain something, anything, but the room did not respond the way it had before. No one looked to him for direction, no one waited for his instruction, because the center had shifted permanently, and Naomi watched him for a brief moment longer before speaking again, quieter now, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You thought this was about who belongs in a lounge," she said, her eyes steady. "It was never about the lounge," and the words settled into the space like a final realization, because what had been exposed here was not access, not policy, but something deeper, something systemic, something that had finally been seen and could not be unseen, and the system continued to run, precise, methodical, and very close to its conclusion. The lounge no longer felt like a place between flights. It felt suspended in something heavier, something slower, like time itself had stretched just enough to make every second count. And Naomi Carter stood in that stillness as the weight of the moment settled fully into the room, not as tension anymore, but as clarity, the kind that comes after something has already broken and cannot be put back the way it was. And for a brief second the noise faded, the quiet conversations, the distant boarding announcements, even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to dissolve into the background. And in that silence Naomi's eyes softened just slightly, not outwardly visible the most, but enough to shift inward, to a memory she did not revisit often but never truly left behind. A smaller terminal years ago, harsh lighting, a long line that barely moved, and a younger version of herself standing with a ticket in hand that had already been paid for twice over in effort, in sacrifice, in belief, only to be told to step aside, to wait, to prove something no one else in that line had been asked to prove. And she remembered the feeling more than the words, the quiet burn of being dismissed without question, the way the room had closed around her without anyone noticing, without anyone speaking, and how she had stood there then, not saying anything, not making a scene, just absorbing it, storing it, turning it into something that would one day make moments like this impossible to ignore. And now here she was again, same pattern, different place, but this time the silence had changed. This time it was not protecting the system, it was exposing it. And Naomi took a slow breath, grounding herself back in the present as the lounge came back into focus, the faces, the phones, the staff who no longer knew where to stand, and the boarding clock dropped to 3 minutes, flashing with urgency that now felt distant compared to the quiet shift happening inside the room. And Ethan Brooks stood there still, no longer trying to lead, no longer trying to correct, just standing in the aftermath of decisions he could not take back. And the junior attendant glanced at him, then back at Naomi, then finally spoke again, her voice no longer hesitant but certain. "They are finalizing the executive review," she said, and that word finalizing carried something different, something nearing completion. And Naomi's gaze lifted slightly, her posture unchanged but her presence now unmistakably decisive. And she looked around the room, not to seek approval, not to acknowledge support, but to recognize what had shifted, the awareness in the passengers, the quiet alignment of those who had witnessed everything unfold. And she spoke again, softer than before, but with a depth that carried through every corner of the space. "This is what happens when silence is mistaken for acceptance," she said, her voice steady. "It builds until it cannot be ignored." And no one interrupted, no one questioned, because everyone in that lounge understood now, not just what had happened, but what it meant. And the system behind the counter refreshed one more time, a final sequence loading into place. And the air itself seemed to hold, waiting, because whatever came next was not going to be a reaction, it was going to be a decision. The word finalizing did not rush the moment. It slowed it down, stretched it just enough for every person in the lounge to feel what was about to happen before it actually did. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of that pause, grounded, composed, her presence no longer questioned but fully understood. And the system behind the counter completed its sequence with a quiet confirmation that did not need sound to be heard, because the shift was immediate, visible in the way the junior attendant's screen changed from observation to action, her eyes widening slightly as she read the update that had just locked into place. And she looked up, not at Ethan this time, but directly at Naomi, as if waiting for acknowledgement, for permission, for confirmation that what she was seeing was real. And Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not dramatic, not performative, just enough. And that was all it took, because the system responded instantly, executive access statuses shifting from active to suspended, credentials flagged, Authority levels recalibrated in real time, and Ethan Brooks felt it before he fully processed it. The sudden absence of control, the invisible structure he had relied on no longer responding the way it had just minutes ago, and he reached instinctively toward the tablet again. But this time it did not respond to him the same way. It did not prioritize him. It did not defer to him. And that realization landed heavier than anything else had so far, because it meant the shift was complete, and a quiet murmur moved through the lounge, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, the collective recognition of a system, correcting itself in real time. And the boarding clock dropped to 2 minutes, flashing with urgency that now felt almost secondary, as if the departure of a flight could wait, but this moment could not. And Naomi took a slow step forward, not to close distance, but to claim space that had always been hers, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the room without force, effective immediately, she said, and even that phrase carried weight, because it did not suggest possibility, it confirmed action. All executive oversight tied to this location is under review and suspended pending audit results. And the words did not rise. They settled, final and complete, and the junior attendant exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering as if something unseen had lifted, while the security officers remained still, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, simply present as the shift completed, and Ethan stood there, no longer asking questions, no longer asserting authority, just absorbing the outcome of a moment that had begun with assumption and ended with consequence. And Naomi's gaze moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the witnesses not with a gesture but with presence, because they had seen it, all of it, the beginning, the escalation, the reveal, and now the result. And she spoke one last time into the space that had once tried to reject her, her voice quiet but unshakable. "You do not measure who belongs by appearance," she said. "You measure it by truth." And the room did not respond with applause, did not break into noise, because what had just happened did not need reaction, it needed understanding. And as the final boarding call echoed faintly in the distance, Naomi turned slightly toward the lounge entrance, not leaving in retreat, but moving forward with the same calm authority she had carried from the start. While behind her the system remained active, the audit still running, the consequences still unfolding, and everyone in that room knew this was not the end of what had just begun. It was only the moment it became impossible to ignore. The final boarding call echoed louder this time, cutting through the lounge with a sense of urgency that no longer matched the stillness inside the room. And yet no one moved, not immediately, because what had just unfolded held them in place, as if stepping away too quickly would mean missing the full weight of what they had witnessed. And Naomi Carter paused near the entrance, not rushing, not looking back right away, allowing the moment behind her to settle completely while the system continued its quiet work, unseen but active. And behind the counter the junior attendant's screen refreshed again, new notifications stacking in precise order, executive credentials formally revoked, access badges disabled, internal communications triggered across departments that had not even been aware of this lounge just minutes ago. And she looked at Ethan Brooks one last time, not with fear now, not even with uncertainty, but with clarity, because whatever authority he had carried into this moment no longer existed in the way it had before. And Ethan stood still, his shoulders slightly lowered, his expression no longer defensive but distant, as if he was trying to understand how quickly everything had shifted, how a single decision had unraveled into something far beyond his control. And a man near the window shook his head slowly, speaking under his breath but loud enough to carry. All of this started because they did not ask a simple question. And that sentence lingered, simple, undeniable, cutting through everything else that had been said. And Naomi finally turned her head slightly, just enough to look back into the room one more time, her gaze moving across the faces, the witnesses, the staff, the space itself. And there was no anger in it, no need for vindication, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been revealed. And she spoke once more, her voice calm, steady, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Respect is not something you grant based on appearance," she said. "It is something you show before you know who you are speaking to." And the words settled into the room like a final note that did not need to be repeated. And for a moment no one spoke, No one reacted outwardly, because the impact was internal now, understood rather than displayed, and the boarding screen flashed. Closed in bold letters, the flight no longer waiting. But Naomi did not rush. She stepped forward with the same measured pace she had carried from the beginning, her presence unchanged despite everything that had happened, because for her this was not a victory. It was a correction, something that had been necessary long before this moment arrived. And as she moved toward the jet bridge entrance, the security officers stepped aside without being asked, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Their posture aligned with the authority that had revealed itself fully, and behind her the lounge began to shift again, slowly returning to motion, but not to what it had been before, because something had changed in the way people looked at one another, in the way silence felt, in the way assumptions now carried weight they had not before, and the system remained active, the audit still unfolding beyond what anyone in that room could see, extending into offices, into reports, into decisions that would not be made in public. And Naomi paused just briefly at the threshold, her phone vibrating one more time, a final confirmation that the process was continuing exactly as intended, and she allowed herself a small breath, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, because this was never about proving who she was. It was about revealing what had always been there. And as she stepped forward out of the lounge and into the corridor beyond, the door slid closed behind her with a quiet finality, leaving the room and everyone in it with one undeniable truth. The moment they thought they were protecting their standards was the moment they exposed them completely. The corridor outside the lounge felt different, quieter but sharper, like the air carried intention instead of comfort. And Naomi Carter walked forward without breaking stride, her pace steady, measured, as if nothing behind her had required urgency, because it had not for her, and the soft hum of airport movement returned gradually. Footsteps, distant announcements, the rolling sound of carry-on wheels against polished floors, all of it continuing as if the last 11 minutes had not just rewritten something far deeper than access to a room. And yet behind her, inside that lounge, everything had shifted, and it showed in the way people began to speak again, not casually, not dismissively, but with a new awareness that had not been there before. And Ethan Brooks remained near the counter, still, not frozen but anchored in the aftermath, his eyes fixed on the space Naomi had just walked through, as if trying to follow something he could no longer reach, while the junior attendant looked back at her screen, then at him, then back again, her voice quieter now but steady. "The audit has expanded beyond this location," she said, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. Because there was nothing left to deny, and a passenger near the center table leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly. "This is what accountability looks like," he said, and no one argued, no one dismissed it, because what had just happened was not loud, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, and undeniable, and the lounge began to move again, but not the way it had before. There was a pause in every interaction now, a moment where assumption used to be, replaced by something more deliberate, more aware, and outside. Naomi approached the gate entrance just as the final call ended, the agent standing there glancing up from the scanner, ready to close the flight. But when Naomi stepped forward and presented her boarding pass, there was no hesitation, no second look, no question, only a quick scan and a professional nod. "You are all set, ma'am," the agent said, and Naomi returned the nod, simple, mutual, as it should have been from the beginning. And as she stepped onto the jet bridge, the noise of the terminal softened behind her, replaced by the quiet, enclosed space that led forward, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to slow, not physically, but mentally, recognizing the weight of what had just unfolded, not as a victory, not as a confrontation, but as a correction that had long been overdue. And her phone vibrated again, a new message appearing on the screen: executive review in progress, compliance team engaged, and beneath it, a single line that confirmed what she already knew: systemic review initiated across all locations. And Naomi's expression remained unchanged, calm, grounded, because this was never about one lounge, one manager, one moment. It was about something larger, something that had finally been seen clearly enough to be addressed. And as she continued down the jet bridge, the aircraft door came into view, open, waiting, and the flight attendant at the entrance greeted her with a professional smile, unaware of everything that had just unfolded beyond that door. And Naomi stepped inside with the same quiet confidence she had carried all along, not needing recognition, not needing acknowledgement, because the truth had already done its work. And back in the lounge, the system continued to run, the consequences still unfolding in places far beyond that room, reaching people who had never been there, who had never seen what happened, but who would feel its impact all the same, because what had begun as a moment of denial had become something else entirely, something that could not be contained and would not be reversed. Inside the aircraft, the world narrowed into something quieter, more contained, where the noise of judgment could not reach as easily, and Naomi Carter stepped into the aisle with the same steady composure she had carried from the moment she entered the lounge, her presence calm, grounded, untouched by the chaos she had just left behind, and passengers were settling into their seats, overhead bins closing, flight attendants moving with practiced efficiency, none of them aware that just minutes ago a system had shifted because one person refused to step aside, and Naomi moved down the aisle without drawing attention, her seat waiting exactly where it had always been, not reassigned, not questioned, not challenged, simply hers, and she placed her bag gently into the overhead compartment, the motion unhurried, deliberate, as if nothing needed to be rushed anymore. And as she took her seat, fastening her seatbelt with a quiet click, her phone vibrated once more, not sharply, not urgently, but with a steady confirmation that the process beyond this plane was still unfolding, and she glanced down briefly, reading the update without surprise. Executive removals initiated, compliance enforcement in progress, and beneath it, a series of acknowledgments from departments that had already begun to respond. And Naomi leaned back slightly, her gaze shifting forward, not focused on the cabin, not on the people around her, but on something beyond it, something that extended far past this single moment, because what had happened was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern that had finally been interrupted, and across the aisle a passenger who had boarded just before her glanced over, recognition flickering in his eyes, not of her identity, but of her presence, the kind that did not demand attention but held it anyway, and he gave a small nod, subtle, respectful, and Naomi returned it just as simply, because respect, when genuine, did not need explanation. And as the aircraft doors began to close, sealing the cabin from the outside world, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and routine, announcing departure, completely unaware that the real departure had already happened, not from a gate, but from a system that had just been forced to confront itself. And Naomi allowed her eyes to close for just a moment, not in exhaustion, not in relief, but in recognition of the quiet shift that had taken place, the kind that did not make headlines immediately, but would ripple through policies, through training, through decisions made in rooms she would never need to enter, because the message had already been delivered, clearly, precisely, and without compromise. And as the engines began to hum beneath the aircraft, building toward motion, Naomi opened her eyes. Again, her expression unchanged, steady, resolved, because she had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She had only needed to stand her ground long enough for the truth to surface, and now that it had, there was nothing left to prove, only the certainty that what had been exposed would not be ignored again, not in that lounge, not in any place that operated under the same system. And as the plane began to move, slowly at first, then with purpose, Naomi remained still, her presence as calm as ever, because real power did not follow the noise. It moved quietly, deliberately, and when it finally revealed itself, it did not need to announce anything at all. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the runway, rising above the city that continued moving below without ever knowing what had just shifted within one of its quietest corners. And Naomi Carter sat still as the ground fell away, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, because for her the altitude was not the story, the movement was not the victory, it was what had been corrected that mattered. And as the cabin settled into the calm rhythm of flight, seatbelt signs dimming, conversations beginning in low tones, the world seemed to return to normal for everyone else. But for Naomi, there was a quiet awareness that nothing was exactly the same anymore, not in the systems that had just been triggered, not in the decisions that would follow, not in the people who had witnessed the moment and would carry it forward in ways they did not yet understand. And her phone vibrated once more, a final update coming through with precise confirmation. Executive removals completed, interim leadership assigned, policy review expanded to all premium access locations, and beneath it a simple acknowledgement line that read audit findings confirmed pattern of bias, corrective actions in effect, and Naomi read it without reaction, without satisfaction, just a quiet acceptance of what had been set into motion, because this had never been about a single apology or a single outcome. It had been about exposure, about forcing a system to see itself clearly enough to change. And across the aisle the same passenger glanced over again, then looked away, not out of discomfort but respect, because something about her presence had made an impression that did not need explanation. And Naomi shifted her gaze toward the window, the sky stretching endlessly outside, vast, uninterrupted, a space where nothing needed to prove it belonged. And for a moment she allowed herself to reflect, not on what had just happened, but on everything that had led to it. The years of being overlooked, questioned, redirected, all of it shaping a quiet resilience that did not break under pressure but sharpened with it. And she remembered standing in places where she had been told to wait, to step aside, to accept less, and how each of those moments had built toward this one, not as revenge, not as a moment of triumph, but as a point of clarity where the cycle finally broke. And as the aircraft leveled out, the captain's voice returned briefly, announcing cruising altitude, routine, controlled, expected, and Naomi closed her eyes for a second, not to rest, but to mark the transition, because what had begun on the ground had not ended when she walked away. It had expanded. It had reached beyond that lounge, beyond that manager, into something larger that would continue long after this flight landed. And when she opened her eyes again, her expression was the same as it had always been, calm, certain, grounded, because she did not need to revisit the moment to understand its impact. She had already moved beyond it. And as the cabin lights dimmed slightly and the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had not needed to argue her place. She had simply stood still long enough for the truth to reveal itself. And when it did, it changed everything without ever needing permission.